Hi everyone, and welcome to Module 2 of our Modern European History course. In today's lecture, we will be covering the history of Italian unification, attempting to flesh out some of the details that are not highlighted in the Merryman textbook. For much of recorded history, Italy was more a geographic location than a nationality. The Romans referred to Italia as the name for the peninsula south of the Alps. These lands were the heartlands of their empire, the center of Latin culture, and the site of the empire's capital, Rome. Following the downfall of Rome, Italy became a battlefield between competing powers and was subject to invasion by the Lombards, Greeks, Arabians, and others. Much of Italy was ruled by powerful city-states within the Holy Roman Empire. In the 15th and 16th century, these wealthy city-states achieved their independence and experienced a cultural renaissance, in which the proud legacy of the ancient past received great interest. Writing in variants of Italian, a number of thinkers proposed that the Italian states should unite to ensure their continued freedom from the French and the Germans. "Seize Italy and free her from the barbarians," wrote the famous political theorist Niccolo Machiavelli. The French conquest of the island of Corsica in the 18th century encouraged a sense of Italian identity from islanders who resisted the invasion. It was then a Corsican, Napoleon Bonaparte, who then conquered Italy while still a general serving the revolutionary French government. After becoming France's leader, Napoleon founded a number of puppet states on the peninsula, including a so-called Kingdom of Italy in the north. Napoleon crowned himself as the Italian king, and his lands were fully dependent on French support to exist. Nonetheless, this Kingdom of Italy left behind a legacy of unification amongst middle-class northern Italians who had benefited from Napoleonic rule. Ancient cities such as Genoa or Venice, meanwhile, lost their independence forever. The Treaty of Vienna in 1815 disappointed nationalists who had hoped for the establishment of a free Italian nation. Instead, much of the peninsula now fell under Austrian control, either directly, as was the case with Venice and Lombardy, or indirectly through Austrian support for a number of smaller Italian states, including Tuscany and the Kingdom of Two Sicilies in the south, the second Sicily being Naples and its surroundings. The northwest of Italy was part of the Kingdom of Sardinia, also known as Sardinia-Piedmont, which was independent of Austrian influence. Dreams of Italian unification were kept alive in the cultural sphere, where the novelist Alessandro Manzoni and the romantic poet Giacomo Leopardi produced masterpieces which ranked among the finest works of literature in the world. The works of both men were not only patriotic, but helped in the development of one consistent Italian language to take place of the patchwork of languages which had proliferated throughout the peninsula. Revolts were constantly being organized by liberals and fought in the name of Italy throughout the peninsula during the first half of the 19th century. Secret revolutionary societies waged a war in the shadows against Austrian and Papal forces as they planned one decisive uprising to free the nation. Poets, musicians, students, and lawyers were particularly prominent in these societies. The upheavals of 1848 began in Sicily, in the city of Palermo, where an uprising forced the Kingdom of Two Sicilies to grant a constitution. Constitutions were subsequently granted in Tuscany, Sardinia, and the Papal States as well. In late March, Italian nationalists in Sardinia pressured the king, Charles Albert, to declare war on Austria. It was a risky decision, but prospects for a national war seemed promising, and he wanted to seize the initiative to preclude Republican and Democratic domination of the insurgency. The Sardinians won a few victories and encouraged Lombardy and Venice to accept a merger before being unable to withstand an Austrian counteroffensive. After a series of defeats, King Charles Albert's forces withdrew from Milan and on August 6th left the city and its insurgents to the mercy of the Austrians. Accusations of royal treachery, formulated by Lombard Democrats at this moment, survived long into the Italian political debates. In Sardinia-Piedmont, the new constitution remained in place and democratic ideals just about survived. The period of peace in northern Italy, following the Napoleonic years, proved conducive to economic growth. Genoa, Turin, and Milan began to lay the foundations for becoming important European financial and industrial centers. Piedmontese and Lombard manufacturing and banking expanded rapidly. In Venice, important land reclamation projects were completed, and in Tuscany, banking and commerce flourished, especially via the port of Livorno or Leghorn in English. Throughout the country, the construction of a railroad network beginning in the 1840s increased commerce. In the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, which dominated the south, however, conditions were worsening. This kingdom was overwhelmingly rural, where peasants scraped out a living under the domination of large landowners. Crime syndicates, such as the mafia, became extremely powerful in the poorest regions of the country. Thousands of peasants began to emigrate to the United States and South America, with the trickle becoming a flood by the time of Italian unification. All in all, approximately 10 million Italians emigrated between 1860 and the years of the First World War. Italian unification eventually came about as a result of royalists and conservatives latching onto and harnessing the powers of liberalism and nationalism. In Sardinia during the early 1850s, the king appointed a new prime minister, Camillo di Cavour, who held support from both the centre-right and the centre-left of parliament, without ever fully belonging to either faction. Cavour worked with both the king and with the liberals, earning their support by sponsoring economic development and granting personal freedom, but most of all by supporting their Italian nationalism. His power and the idea of a politically moderate Italian unification both grew at the same time as a more radical path to Italian unification was being discredited and defeated during the course of failed uprisings in Milan and Mantua. Cavour's most successful maneuvers came in the realm of foreign policy. Cavour earned the gratitude of the French and the British by sending Sardinian forces to help the Allies to win the Crimean War. Even more importantly, this gave Sardinia-Piedmont a seat at the subsequent peace treaty negotiations at the Congress of Paris. In Paris, Cavour met with Europe's most capable diplomats and was able to examine the reasons behind the policies of the great powers. With constant and tireless energy, he succeeded in winning French Emperor Napoleon III over to the cause of Italian nationalism. Cavour's successful argument was his proposition that France would be re-established as the leading power in Europe by sending an expedition into Italy that would replace Austrian domination of the peninsula with the domination of France. At a secret meeting in July 1858, Napoleon III and Cavour agreed to provoke a European war against Austria the following year. The scheming of both men almost failed entirely. At the first suspicions of a secret agreement, the European powers, especially the UK, began a campaign to prevent the French and Sardinians from carrying out their plan, pushing Cavour toward the brink of personal and national catastrophe. He was saved by an incredible blunder on the part of Austria, which sent an ultimatum threatening war unless Sardinia disarmed at once. The Franco-Sardinian alliance accordingly came into force, and in 1859 the Austrians were crushed in a number of battles with Napoleon III directing the victorious French campaign in person, and at Solferino defeating Franz Joseph of Austria, who directly commanded the Habsburg forces. After Solferino, the Franco-Sardinians drove Austria from the province of Lombardy and its capital, Milan. Napoleon III now got cold feet, perhaps taken aback by the speed with which the Austrian forces had crumbled, as well as the nationalist risings that erupted throughout Italy. Napoleon signed an armistice with Emperor Franz Joseph I at Villafranca in July 1859, which granted the King of Sardinia, Victor Emmanuel, the territory of Lombardy, but fell far short of creating an Italian nation-state. Cavour vented his frustration on the king and resigned. This armistice was, however, too little, too late. The revolutionary landslide in Italy could no longer be checked, with uprisings occurring in Tuscany, the duchies of Modena and Parma, and in the Papal States. Cavour was returned to power in January 1860 and added the rebellious lands of North and Central Italy to Victor Emmanuel's kingdom. In return, he had to give both Nice and his homeland of Savoy to the French. Giving Nice to France outraged Italian nationalist Giuseppe Garibaldi, for the city was the popular hero's birthplace. Garibaldi resolved to rectify this loss by conquering southern Italy, which was still held under the control of the ancient Bourbon dynasty. Despite a shortage of weapons, Garibaldi's volunteers landed on May 11, 1860, and in less than 3 months conquered the entire island of Sicily. Garibaldi's daring and skill and the indigenous revolutionary ferment on Sicily accounted for the success of his expedition. Still, the attitude of the Sicilian peasants remained ambivalent. They initially welcomed the invading force, but then quickly became disillusioned as Garibaldi's reluctance to order the breakup of secular landed estates became clear. Seeing the popularity of the invasion from Turin, Cavour meanwhile feared a republican coup d'état. As the European powers attempted to mediate the situation, the new king of the two Sicilies, Francis II, granted a constitution and promised amnesty to all rebels in Sicily. At this point, without the consent of Victor Emmanuel, Garibaldi crossed the straits and by September 7th made a triumphant entry into Naples. On October 1st, the last serious resistance to the Bourbon army collapsed at the Battle of Volturno. Garibaldi's conquests and his popularity highlighted the difference between a dramatic, revolutionary Italian nationalism and the more moderate, careful nationalism of Cavour. Cavour decided to seize the initiative back by sending an army from the north to restore order in the south. Conveniently, this army crossed into and conquered half of the Papal States along the way. Garibaldi had the sense to back down and received the visit of the king, who travelled south and was hailed as the King of Italy. The Kingdom of Italy was then officially proclaimed on March 17, 1861, by a parliament assembled in Turin. Soon afterwards, Cavour asserted that Rome must become the capital of the new state, pushing for another war with the Pope before his untimely death on June 6th. For the time being, Rome remained independent, protected by the French. The new country of Italy had a parliament, although extensive powers remained with the crown, which included the appointment of ministers to cabinet positions. Very few members of the public, 2.5% to be precise, were allowed to vote. Whilst this was extreme, it should be remembered that out of Italy's 26 million inhabitants, an incredible 78% were illiterate. 70% of the adult population were peasants engaged in agriculture. The free trade and centralizing policies pursued by the moderate governments of the north ruined the weak industry that had existed in the south and which the Bourbon government had previously sheltered. Railroads were constructed throughout Italy, although construction in southern regions was beset with corruption in the issuance of contracts. Relief for the poor and public education remained miserably inadequate. Poverty was everywhere, but perhaps nowhere as prevalent as in Naples, the largest city in Italy, which was constantly beset by disease. The political situation in Italy continued to be defined by the constitution Charles Albert had given the Sardinian liberals back in 1848. The liberal nationalist coalition that dominated parliament was deferential to the monarchy, but at the same time vigorously attacked the power of the Roman Catholic Church, calling for an end to church prerogatives in areas such as education. Radical opinions were cracked down upon whenever they were raised. Commentators noticed that the Conservatives and the Liberals in Parliament were so similar that they operated as virtually identical power seekers. In the South, the free trade Liberals grew so unpopular that men on horseback began occupying villages, killing Liberal representatives, and raising the white flag of the Bourbon Kingdom. The government sent some 116,000 soldiers, 2/5 of the entire Italian army, to the south to combat this lawlessness. Socialism, meanwhile, was stifled by the small size of Italian industry, but slowly gained in support. Reformers were mostly focused on the acquisition of Rome and Venice into the Italian nation. In 1866, Italian forces captured Venice from the Austrians, who were distracted by their ongoing war with Prussia. Garibaldi's attempts to push the invasion further into the Austrian Alps were thwarted, as were his attempts to invade Rome, with the invasion being repulsed by French troops. However, Napoleon I's defeat against Prussia in 1870 and his subsequent abdication then deprived the Pope of French military protection. On September 20th, 1870, Italian troops breached Rome's walls at Porta Pia and entered the city. Refusing to accept Italy's occupation, Pius IX withdrew and declared himself a prisoner in the Vatican Palace, a position that his successors maintained until 1929. Italy was now unified, although nationalists, flushed with success, dreamt of further conquests in France, the Alps, and on the Balkan coast. For the time being, however, Italy sought colonies to prove its importance amongst the great powers. It built up a colonial empire in Eritrea, Somalia, and Libya, although none of these colonies were held in high regard by the other European powers. An invasion of Ethiopia in 1896 was defeated at the Battle of Adwa, a defining moment in the development of Ethiopian national identity and Pan-African sentiment. Italian nationalism, meanwhile, would continue to grow unchecked.